Stop right there. Do not drink that.
Eunice, what is it?
It's not safe. Trust me. Just listen. They have increased the drops.
I'm tired of waiting for him to die.
2 more weeks and his heart fails naturally, then we own everything.
Young-hwan raised the crystal glass to his lips, standing in the shadow of his own kitchen, his mind on shipping routes and the quiet exhaustion that had been eating him alive for months. The green juice looked exactly as it always did. He had no reason to pause. Then a hand clamped firmly over his mouth, and he turned to find Eunice Brown, his private cook of 11 years, in her white uniform, hand shaking, eyes completely serious. "Stop right there," she whispered. "Do not drink that." Nobody touched him. Nobody gave him orders. But Eunice pointed one trembling finger toward the open lounge doorway and told him to just listen, that they had increased the drops. Through the mansion's open glass walls, he saw his wife Megan on the leather sofa, laughing softly while Louis Tate, his chief security officer, the man he had treated like family, kissed her neck. "I'm tired of waiting for him to die," Megan said impatiently. 2 more weeks and his heart fails naturally. Then we own everything." Young-hwan's hand tightened around the glass. Eunice placed one quiet hand on his forearm. He looked at her aged, steady fingers, looked back at his wife laughing in the expensive lamplight, and chose something colder than rage. He poured the poisoned juice down the sink with no drama and no sound, rinsed the glass clean, and told Eunice to make him a fresh glass. Same color, nothing else. As she worked, he leaned against the counter and studied his own hands, which were completely steady, and that surprised him because he had expected fury to be shaking him apart. Instead, he felt cold and precise, the kind of clarity that had made him dangerous when he was young and had nothing to lose. He asked how long she had known, and she said 3 days, that she had needed to be sure, and when he asked if she had told anyone, she said only her daughter. Trinicia had come back the week before and had been watching the estate from inside, working as the mechanic, thinking he didn't know she was there. He had known. He simply hadn't cared enough to ask why. Now he cared very much. Eunice set the clean glass on the counter, and their eyes met briefly with no words needed between them. She had just risked her life. He was the only one who could make sure it hadn't been wasted. The predator began to play dead. Hello, family. Welcome back to the channel. Before we dive into this intense emotional roller coaster of betrayal and ultimate revenge, I need to know, where are you watching from? Drop your flag in the comments and hit subscribe if you haven't subscribed yet. Now, let's proceed to the story. The next morning, Megan brought the juice to the table herself, which she had never done before, and the fact that she did it now, smiling warmly, but setting it down like a gift, told Young-hwan everything about how confident she had become. He picked up the glass with fingers he carefully made tremble and took a long sip. Bitter kale and sweet apple, Eunice had swapped the batch before dawn, and he swallowed slowly while Luis stood in the corner with his arms crossed, watching every move. Young-hwan set the glass down and told Megan she looked beautiful today, and something flickered across her face. A shadow of discomfort, because a woman expecting a dying man does not expect compliments. She thanked him, turned away, and told him to rest. He said he planned to. He watched her leave with Luis following behind, wearing his practiced mask of loyalty, and then sat alone in the bright dining room sipping clean juice, thinking about every person in this house who believed he was already finished. He began mapping the architecture of their complete and total destruction, and he found the work deeply satisfying. His younger brother, Sojin, arrived wearing a perfectly tailored gray suit and a mask of deep concern, placing a warm hand on Young-hwan's shoulder and saying softly that he looked terrible and should rest while he handled the docks and shipping routes. Young-hwan leaned back and coughed, shallow, wet, exactly what was expected, and told Sojin he was kind. Sojin smiled. And there it was behind the warmth, a thin gleam of something sharp and hungry, the look of a man measuring furniture in a house he intends to move into very soon. Young-hwan thought back 11 years and remembered who had first introduced Louis Tate to the family, vouching for him, placing him carefully like a piece on a board. So-jin. The puzzle didn't click together. It detonated. This was not Megan's scheme or Louis's ambition alone. Those were instruments. But So-jin had composed the entire song from the beginning, patient and brilliant and completely invisible. Young-hwan squeezed So-jin's hand and smiled the smile of a man not dying nearly fast enough, said he trusted him completely, and went to find Trinicia. She slid out from under the luxury SUV before he reached the garage door, not startled but expecting him. Trinicia Brown wiped grease from her forearm and stood holding a wrench loosely at her side, sharp-jawed, stays completely unintimidated, looking at him like he was a problem she had already solved. She told him he was blocking her light. He said her mother had told him she was here, and she said her mother told her everything, and it was exactly why she had come back. She reached under the car, pulled out a brown folder and tossed it onto the hood. Inside were photographs, financial records, handwritten timelines, and a breakdown of every security blind spot on the estate. 8 months of meticulous work. By month 2, she knew it was the juice. By month 4, she knew it was Louis. By month 6, she had So-jin's fingerprints on the source of the poison. Her terms were simple. When it was over, the empire ended completely and he walked away clean or not at all. The most powerful criminal in the city looked at a mechanic in dirty overalls and said he agreed without hesitation. She handed him a second folder. But this one had a plan inside. The boardroom performance was Trenicia's idea entirely. She told him precisely what to do. Appear at the meeting, show visible decline, let So-jin step forward, and let the vultures believe the king was finally falling. Young-hwan walked into the boardroom, gripped the edge of the glass table, let his breathing go shallow and audible, and knocked a crystal water glass off the edge where it shattered loudly on the marble floor. So-jin was at his side in 4 steps, announcing the meeting was over and guiding him gently from the room, and the lieutenants watched with something Young-hwan had never seen on their faces, genuine pity. He let them help him out and noted every face, every lieutenant who looked towards So-jin instead of him, filing each one carefully away. That night, locked in his private office and finally alone, he called his last 2 truly loyal guards and told them quietly to double protection on Eunice Brown and her daughter, to stay completely invisible, and to make sure both women stayed alive no matter what happened inside these walls in the days ahead. They met in the garage at midnight. Trinicia had the estate's full security grid spread across the car hood, camera positions, guard rotation schedules, at every blind spot marked in red, pulled from maintenance files nobody had thought to lock because nobody ever considered the mechanic worth watching. Young-hwan stood across from her in his dark suit while she stood in her work overalls pointing out the gaps without being asked. The northeast corner of the garden went dark between 2:14 and 2:19 every night, long enough to reach the outer wall where a car sat waiting on the service road. She drove. They worked through the route twice, out of their shoulders brushing once as they leaned over the blueprint with neither of them speaking, the cold garage air completely still between them. He asked after a moment why she had become a mechanic, and she looked up and told him her mother had cooked for powerful men her whole life, and she had decided she'd rather fix what was broken than serve what was breaking. She folded the blueprint, picked up her keys, and told him to let's go. And the quiet efficiency of her, the complete absence of ceremony, was something he had never encountered in anyone before. The corrupt doctor came Thursday morning, adjusted his expensive glasses, held his fake chart, and told Young-hwan his liver was failing rapidly. A natural illness, nothing to be done, 3 weeks at most. With smooth, rehearsed compassion while Megan cried beautifully beside the bed, convincingly enough that Young-hwan realized she had been practicing for some time. He nodded and let his shoulders fall and played the defeated man without a single crack. From the hallway, through the ventilation grate she had loosened 2 days earlier, Trinicia watched everything. She saw the sweat genuinely real on his forehead, saw how his hands gripped the bedsheet when the doctor turned away. Not defeat, but barely contained fury. and understood the digitalis was still active in his body, and he was in real pain. She stayed until the doctor and Megan both left, then pressed her back against the wall and breathed slowly. She had thought of him as a problem to be solved, a corrupt king to be outmaneuvered on her mother's behalf. But watching him hold himself together in a room full of people celebrating his death, she felt something shift inside her chest that she didn't yet have a name for. The blood test confirmed everything. The private doctor set the results down carefully and explained cardiac glycoside toxicity, consistent with sustained low-dose digitalis poisoning over 4 to 6 months, the heart under significant strain but manageable if exposure stopped immediately. On the drive back, Trinicia kept her eyes on the road before telling him the compound she had sourced would suppress his heart rate far enough to pass any portable field monitor, that he would be unconscious for roughly 3 hours, and the reversal agent would bring him back completely clean. He asked what happened if it didn't, and she said without looking over that her plans didn't have flaws. Back at the estate, she pulled into the garage and killed the engine, and neither of them moved immediately. He told her that when he went under, he would be completely helpless, and she said yes. He said he had never been helpless in his life, and she finally looked at him and said she knew, and that she would be the one watching, and that nothing would touch him while she was there. He believed her completely and without hesitation, and that was the thing that surprised him most of all. Eunice walked into the kitchen at midnight to prepare the morning vegetables, as she did every night. 11 years of habit, the quiet darkness of the house, something she had always preferred. Tonight, the kitchen was not empty. Megan stood at the open refrigerator in a dark silk dress holding a small glass vial over Younghwan's morning juice. Adding drops far larger than anything Eunice had ever seen before, her hand perfectly and terrifyingly steady. Eunice's top plate slipped from her hands and hit the marble floor like a gunshot, the sound exploding through the silent room. Megan turned slowly and did not look frightened or guilty. She looked at Eunice the way you look at a loose thread, with quiet, practical irritation, and set the vial on the counter and stared at the old cook without moving or speaking. Neither woman said a word. The silence between them was not empty, but loaded with everything that had been happening in this house for months, all of it now stripped bare and exposed between them in the cold kitchen air. Eunice looked at the vial and understood clearly and completely that the game had just changed. Luis came in from the shadows, as he always did, and Eunice had noticed that habit of his years ago before she understood what it meant. He told her quietly she was too nosy, and she did not run. She stood straight, raised a shard of broken china, and opened her mouth to scream. Luis crossed the room before the sound formed, grabbed her wrists, and the struggle was short because he was 40 years younger and had spent his life doing exactly this. He shoved her hard toward the island counter, and her foot caught the floor tile and she fell backward, but she didn't hit the marble corner. A pair of hands caught her from behind and guided her down with controlled precision onto the kitchen floor. She lay completely still and held her breath. She had practiced this exact moment. Luis placed a wet towel near her feet to support the accident story and walked out. 30 seconds later, Younghwan's loyal guard slipped through the service door, confirmed her pulse, and helped her quietly out before any examiner arrived. What Luis had so carefully staged as a tragedy was missing the one thing that made it real: a body. The automotive-grade mannequin had been sourced by Trinicia 4 months earlier, aged, dressed in Eunice's spare uniform, and stored in the back of the parts room until needed. It was in place before the household woke up. When Younghwan walked into the kitchen and saw the figure on the floor, the grief that hit him was entirely real. Trinicia hadn't reached him the night before, and he didn't yet know. The heavy doors burst open, and Trinicia came running in with her boots sliding on the tiles, and she made a sound that stopped everyone in the room, broken and agonizing, and not entirely performance, because her mother had genuinely almost died, and the weight of that was real. Younghwan pulled her against him before he thought about it, and she buried her face in his suit. And the cold fury inside him became something specific and permanent. He leaned down and swore on his life he would burn their entire world to ashes. Against his shoulder, barely audible, she whispered that her mother was alive, and she would explain everything tonight. He went completely still, and she walked away without looking back, leaving him standing in the kitchen surrounded by his enemies. She told him everything in the underground garage that night, and he listened without speaking. And when she finished, he sat on the concrete floor with his back against the car and his eyes closed before saying she had planned all of this before she ever spoke to him. She said yes. He said including protecting her mother's life, and she told him quietly that Eunice was her mother and not his to protect. Hers. He asked her to walk him through the compound again, and she slid the metal case across the floor, and inside the small tube of blue liquid caught the dim light. She explained his heart rate would drop to near flat, that he would appear clinically dead to any portable monitor, and that until the reversal agent stabilized him, he would be completely helpless. He told her she had said that twice now, and she said she needed him to understand exactly what he was handing her. He looked at the tube and then at her and said he understood. She told him the paramedics were hired, the route planned, the apartment ready, and she didn't need his approval, only his trust. He said quietly there was a difference between those two things, and she said yes, and he took the case. The gala was Megan's idea, a public appearance by the bereaved wife beside her dying husband, and Trinicia had let her plan it because it was the perfect stage. Yonghwan moved through the grand hotel ballroom leaning on a cane with his skin a careful shade of gray and his eyes dim and sunken, looking like a man already halfway gone, while Megan floated beside him in a black dress with her grief exquisitely practiced. Across the ballroom, Trinicia moved between guests in a white catering uniform with an invisible earpiece, her eyes never stopping their sweep of the room, watching him from 20 feet away and feeling the ache of his careful performance somewhere she didn't want to examine. He caught her eye once across the crowd, and the fire behind his dim act was still completely burning. She could see it clearly, and she looked away quickly before anyone noticed. She murmured into the earpiece asking for position and heard back that the ambulance was ready and the reversal agent was loaded. She set her tray down on a passing cart and said quietly that they would begin, and everything they had built together for months moved into its final stage. Yonghwan stepped up to the microphone, and the ballroom went completely silent, hundreds of faces turning toward the dying king for what everyone believed was a final address. He gripped the podium and let the microphone catch his shallow, labored breathing. And in the front row, Luis stood with arms crossed and a carefully hidden smile, and Yonghwan looked directly at him for one long, cold second before he gasped and let his hands leave the podium and let his body pitch backward and hit the stage with a sound that wiped every other noise from the room. Screaming erupted instantly, and the hired paramedics materialized from the crowd with practiced urgency, attached a monitor to his chest, and a long, flat tone filled the entire ballroom while the green line held perfectly and completely still. Megan screamed and reached toward the stretcher with her beautiful, practiced grief, and the paramedics pushed past her, out through the heavy doors, into the cold night air with sirens starting immediately. The king was dead. Every television in the city would confirm it within the hour, and in the estate, So-jin would already be reaching for his phone. And the final chapter of the plan Trinicia had built was now fully and irreversibly in motion. Within the hour, every major news network ran the story, breaking banners, somber anchors, the untouchable king of the Korean mafia dead of sudden heart failure at a public event. In the estate, Megan and Luis opened expensive champagne. In the boardroom, So-jin made quiet phone calls in the dark. In a narrow alley 4 miles away, Trinicia's rusted truck idled beside the stopped ambulance, and she helped carry the unconscious boss into the back seat herself and drove without speaking. At the 20-minute mark, she heard his breathing change and told him without looking over not to sit up yet, and he didn't. They drove another 10 minutes in silence before he asked in a rough, dry voice where they were going. She told him somewhere safe, which meant somewhere small. She drove with both hands on the wheel and eyes fixed forward, not allowing herself to process the last several hours yet because there was still too much remaining to be done, and she had learned long ago that feeling things fully had to wait until the work was completely finished. What she could not entirely suppress was the specific and unfamiliar relief that moved through her when she heard him breathing steadily beside her. He woke on a couch too short for him, staring at a water-stained ceiling. The apartment was small and quiet and smelled like coffee and vanilla soap, a single lamp burning in the corner and his suit jacket folded neatly over the back of a chair. Trinicia sat across the room with her laptop open, still in her work clothes as if she hadn't slept. He sat up slowly with everything aching and asked how long, and she said 6 hours, that he was stable, and told him to eat, gesturing toward the counter where a bowl of rice and a hot mug were waiting. He sat there a moment, taking stock, the feared head of the Korean mafia in a borrowed apartment, wearing a crumpled shirt with no empire, no guards, no name the world recognized as living. Then he ate the rice. Trinicia closed the laptop and looked at him steadily and told him there was something else he needed to know. He said to tell him. She said her mother wanted to talk to him. He set the bowl down carefully and said that her mother was dead, and Trinicia looked at him and said simply, "Is she?" And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Yonghwan had absolutely no answer. Eunice was in a safe house 2 miles east, sitting at a folding table in a plain cardigan with a cup of tea, looking smaller without her white uniform, but with eyes exactly as Yonghwan remembered, completely steady and entirely unbothered by any of it. She told him to sit down and that he looked terrible. He told her she was supposed to be dead, and she said so was he and told him again to sit, and he did, and she pushed the tea toward him. He asked why she had done it, why she had risked her life instead of walking away. And she said she had worked for powerful men her whole life, and some were bad men who knew it, and some were bad men who didn't, and he had always been the second kind. She thought if someone showed him the door, he might actually walk through it. He was quiet a long time before saying she had risked everything on that, and she said simply she had raised her daughter on it, and that Trinicia was better at the execution. From the doorway, Trinicia made a sound that might have been a laugh. Yonghwan said thank you quietly and without ceremony. Eunice patted his hand once and said cheerfully that now they should talk about destroying So-jin. That night, Trinicia hacked into the estate's security feeds in under 4 minutes. The screen showed the private study where Megan and Luis sat with champagne, laughing. Megan saying he had actually thought she loved him, Luis calling him a rich fool who had made them both very wealthy. Yonghwan reached over and held Trinicia's hand where it rested on the floor between them and held it until the tightness in his jaw released, and she did not pull away. On screen, the study doors opened and So-jin walked in, wearing the cool expression of an employer reviewing employees who had completed their usefulness, telling them pleasantly they had done exactly what he needed and to enjoy their evening. Yonghwan watched So-jin settle into the leather chair at the head of the room, his chair, and said quietly, So-jin had always been the one behind everything. Trinicia said yes. He said she had known from month 4, and she said month 3. That she had wanted to be certain. He asked what they were going to do about him, and she said they were going to let him win until they needed him to lose, and she already knew precisely how that would look. 3 days later, the boardroom feed showed So-jin walking in confidently to address the lieutenants with controlled grief, before pressing a remote that brought up footage of Megan and Luis laughing about Digitalis. Clear audio, a perfectly damning, and announcing he had already contacted the authorities because his brother had deserved better. The lieutenants bowed, and So-jin accepted their loyalty with gracious, practiced humility. In the apartment, Yonghwan said So-jin had recorded them all along, planning to use their prison sentences to buy himself the crown with completely clean hands. Trinicia agreed it was very clean. Then said the problem with recording people in your own house was that the cameras worked both ways, and pulled up a second audio file, So-jin's own voice months earlier, in a private conversation with Luis, explaining the Digitalis and laying out the entire succession plan in confident detail, because he had believed those walls were only ever listening for him, Young Hwan said she had had this since month 3, and she said month 2, that she had wanted to be very certain before she moved. She closed the laptop and told him it was almost time, and the quiet certainty in her voice made the word almost feel like a promise. 2 weeks passed, and the poison left his system slowly, while Trinicia cooked with an engineer's precision, everything measured and timed and effective. And one evening they sat together on the small couch reviewing the timeline for what remained, their shoulders touching and neither moving away. He asked what she wanted when it was done, and she said she wanted to open a school for engineering and aviation, for kids from parts of the city that never got access to that world and that she already had a name. The Eunice Brown Aviation and Engineering Academy. He said nothing for a moment and then told her Eunice would absolutely hate that, and Trinicia almost smiled and said she knew that her mother would hate it loudly and show up without fail every single morning. He reached over and took her hand then, deliberately, differently from the steadying grip during the laptop vigil, and she looked at their hands and then at him and said they needed to finish this first. He agreed without hesitation. Neither one let go for the rest of the evening, and outside the small apartment the city moved through its ordinary night completely unaware that the man it had buried was sitting quietly inside it, planning everything. Sojin's plan moved exactly on schedule. Megan and Luis were arrested Thursday morning, had the evidence package delivered to the prosecutor with legal precision, and every outlet covered it as a grieving family member turning in his brother's killers, a clean and beautiful story. In the estate study, they turned on each other within the hour, screaming and blaming while Sojin watched through a glass partition with the satisfaction of a man whose instruments had fully served their purpose. He was still watching when his phone buzzed with an unknown number he ignored. Then buzzed again, and on the third call he picked up and heard silence before a voice came through that stopped every thought in his head. "Hello, little brother Sojin," said Younghwan. The phone dropped from his hand. He stood in the study, surrounded by his new empire and his fresh champagne and his years-long perfect plan, and his hands began shaking with a force he could not control, because the man he had spent years erasing was not erased. And somewhere out in the city, the ghost of the Korean mafia was already moving, already coming, and everything Sojin had so carefully built was already beginning to come completely apart at every single seam. He told himself it was impossible, a trick, a voice filter, a desperate gambit. But his hands would not stop shaking, and that told him the truth his mind refused. Sojin spent the next 48 hours consolidating power at aggressive speed, moving assets and shifting accounts and calling in favors, still brilliant, still adapting, not knowing that every account he touched Trinicia had already flagged, that every transfer was being documented in real time, and that every call was being recorded through a system she had embedded in the estate's communication infrastructure 3 months earlier. He was building a meticulous legal case against himself and didn't know it. In the apartment, Younghwan watched him work on the feed and said simply that Sojin was scared. Trinicia said good, let him be scared for a few more days and let him believe that fear looked like power. She walked him through the final plan, the boardroom on Friday morning, walking in while Sojin addressed the lieutenants, and she would handle everything before he arrived so that all he had to do was show up. He repeated it flatly, and she told him to try not to be dramatic about it. And the corner of his mouth moved in a way that was almost a smile. Thursday night. Younghwan stood in the center of the apartment and put on the black suit, the trembling performance gone and the gray makeup washed away, his eyes sharp and dark and burning with something colder and more deliberate than anger. He loaded the silver handgun with a quiet metallic click and holstered it, not intending to use it, but completely done pretending to be unarmed in his own war. When he turned around, Trinicia was already at the door in a black leather jacket and dark pants with a tablet under one arm and a small equipment case in her hand, looking like someone who had decided quietly and completely that nothing was going to stop her today. They looked at each other across the small apartment that had been their hiding place and their beginning, the water-stained ceiling, the the coffee smell, the too short couch, and he asked if there were any last adjustments, and she said no. Everything was ready. She opened the door and he walked through it. Behind them, the apartment sat quiet and dark, and they left it without looking back, carrying everything it had given them forward into the last thing that remained to be done. Friday morning, 60th floor, the glass boardroom. Sojin arrived at 9 with the calm authority of a man who believed the hardest part was behind him. He had mourned publicly, prosecuted the guilty, stepped cleanly into power, and told the assembled lieutenants his brother had been a great man and what was done to him was unforgivable, but they would honor his memory by keeping what he built strong. The lieutenants listened, and Sojin stood at the head of the table, looking exactly like what he had always intended to become. At 9:14, the lights flickered and he paused. At 9:15, the boardroom doors slammed shut with a heavy mechanical boom that rang off every glass wall, the locks engaging with a sound like finality, and several lieutenants rose while Sojin reached for his phone and found no signal. The lights cut out entirely, and a single red emergency light pulsed on, painting every face in the room the same low and bloody color. Sojin turned toward the private elevator and watched the floor indicator moving upward with the focused dread of a man who already knew on some deep level that whatever was coming through those doors was going to end everything. 59. 60. The doors opened. Trinicia walked out first with her tablet under one arm and a wireless microphone in her hand, crossing the room and connecting it to the boardroom's speaker system with the same efficient purpose she brought to every job. Sojin demanded to know who she was, and she told him pleasantly she was the mechanic and had been fixing things around here for a while. She set her tablet on the glass table, turned it toward the room, and pressed play. Sojin's own voice filled the boardroom, months younger, in the estate study with Luis, explaining the digitalis, describing the succession plan, laying out every detail in the confident tone of a man who believed those walls only ever listened for him. The silence that followed was the kind that happens when a room full of people realizes simultaneously that everything they understood was wrong. The lieutenant nearest Sojin leaned visibly away from him. Others exchanged glances. Sojin's mouth opened and produced nothing. Then the elevator doors opened again behind Trinicia, and heavy, confident footsteps crossed the threshold, and Young Hwan walked into the room wearing his black suit and his living face. And Sojin made a sound that was not a word and stumbled backward into his chair. All the color left Sojin's face at once. His hands gripped the armrests, and his entire composed performance dissolved in a single moment as Young Hwan walked slowly to the head of the glass table and stood there looking at each lieutenant in turn, some already recalibrating, their loyalty shifting back to where it had always actually belonged, before finally looking at Sojin and letting the silence sit for as long as it deserved. He said he had taught him everything, and Sojin whispered yes with a voice barely working. Young Hwan said he had forgotten to teach him one thing, and Sojin swallowed and asked what, and Young Hwan said that he never stopped watching, then nodded once to the security camera above the door. Trinicia pressed the second button from the van below, and outside on the street, 60 floors down, the first sirens began to wail, growing louder and closer fast, and every person in that sealed, red-lit room understood simultaneously that there was no version of this morning in which Sojin walked out free. The plan that had taken years to build and months to execute was over in the time it took a dead man to cross a room and take back his chair. The evidence package had been in the prosecutor's hands since 8:45 that morning. The financial transfers, 8 months of communication logs, the original recordings, the doctor's full analysis confirming the poison and its source, and Sojin's accounts had been frozen since 7 a.m. When police entered the boardroom, he did not resist. He sat looking at the table as officers moved around him, was wearing the expression of a man who has been completely outplayed and is intelligent enough to understand that fighting it now would only make things worse. He looked at Young Hwan one final time and said he had been supposed to die, and Young Hwan said he knew, and an officer placed a hand on his shoulder, and he stood and went quietly without another word. The room emptied slowly, most lieutenants avoiding eye contact and a few pausing to bow briefly toward young Juan as they passed. That one older lieutenant stopped near Trinicia at the door and looked at her carefully and asked who she was. She considered it without rushing and told him she was the one who built this. He studied her for a long moment with the measuring eyes of a man who had spent decades assessing where power actually lived, and then he bowed to her, slightly but genuinely and with complete sincerity, and left. Downstairs, the police were processing Megan and Luis in the lobby. Des and Trinicia took the stairs with young Juan following without being asked. Luis saw her approaching and went very still. She stopped close enough that he had no choice but to look at her and told him in a completely even voice that he had thought her mother was a loose end, an old woman who had seen too much, and that he had thought the hardest part of what he did was making it look like an accident. She told him Eunice had been the whole plan. Every single part of what had just happened to him had started with one phone call her mother made 8 months ago, and Eunice hadn't run or hidden, but simply called her daughter and told her to fix it. "You're going to spend the rest of your life in a cell," Trinicia said, thinking about the fact that the old cook beat you. The officers moved him away. Young Juan stood beside Trinicia and said nothing because there was nothing to add to that. She exhaled slowly and said it was done. "Aye," and he said, almost, and she looked at him. He told her there was one more thing in the lobby and to just come, and something in his voice made her follow without asking what. The lobby elevator doors opened, and Eunice Brown stepped out wearing her white chef's uniform, freshly pressed as though laundered specifically for this occasion. Carrying a small paper bag and surveying the lobby full of police and handcuffed figures with the mild appraising calm of someone arriving for a regular morning shift. The 2 loyal guards flanked her and quietly stepped aside. Trinicia's hand came up over her mouth. Young Juan stood completely still. But Eunice walked across the lobby at her own unhurried pace and stopped in front of them both and held up the paper bag and said she had brought rice cakes because someone should eat something, and they had clearly all had a very long morning. Trinicia crossed the distance in 2 steps and wrapped both arms around her mother with a force that would have knocked a smaller woman sideways, and Eunice held her daughter tightly and looked over her shoulder at young Juan, who could not find a single word. She reached out with one free hand and patted his cheek, exactly as she had done years ago when he came to the kitchen unable to sleep, and she had given him tea and told him to rest, and said gently that he should close his mouth because he looked absolutely ridiculous. Trinicia laughed, really laughed, and the sound of it filled the cold lobby like the first warm thing in a very long winter. By 6 months later, the estate gardens had been transformed. White flowers and warm lanterns, string lights in the old oak trees, tables set across the grass where surveillance equipment once sat buried. And the wedding was deliberately small, with no lieutenants and no empire, only mechanics and cooks and people who had stayed loyal not from fear, but from something that never needed a name. Trinicia walked down the aisle in a white dress chosen in under 10 minutes, and young Juan waited at the end of it in a dark suit with eyes that had spent years being described as cold and were not cold now. When she reached him and he took her hands, he forgot entirely the speech he had prepared and told her so, and she said she knew because she had read it, and it was good, and he started to ask how, and she said she might have checked his email and that he should say something real instead. He looked at her and told her she had rebuilt him, that he hadn't known he was broken until she showed him what whole looked like. She held his gaze for a moment and said that was considerably better than the speech. In the front row, Eunice ate a rice cake and pressed a napkin to her eyes and convinced absolutely no one present that she was not crying. 1 year after the wedding, the garage was unrecognizable, open and bright with clean tools and new workbenches. On nothing remaining of the dark space where blueprints had been spread across car hoods, and a man had learned to trust someone for the first time in his life. A sign in brushed steel above the entrance read, Eunice Brown Aviation and Engineering Academy. Einid and Trinicia stood at the ribbon with scissors while 20 students sat in folding chairs on the forecourt. teenagers from parts of the city that did not typically produce engineers. And Eunice stood beside her daughter in a pressed white shirt she said felt strange but wore without complaint. Young Juan stood slightly behind them both, having spent the past year dismantling the empire piece by piece and redirecting what remained into things that could last without fear holding them up. Slower work than building, and he was learning every day to prefer it. Trinicia cut the ribbon, and Eunice immediately told 3 students they were sitting wrong and marched them inside, and young Juan took Trinicia's hand as they followed the crowd through the doors into the noise and light of something new. Not an empire, nothing built on shadow, just a room full of young people being handed tools they didn't know they'd been missing, with Eunice already at the front, telling someone firmly to pay attention, which was, young Juan thought, the most powerful thing he had ever witnessed. If this story resonates with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Turn on your notifications so you never miss an upload. We want to hear from you. What was your absolute favorite moment or plot twist in this story? Let us know down in the comments. Thanks for watching.